We are joined now, as promised, by Dr. Claud Anderson, author of the book Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. And Dr. Anderson, I'd like to say once again thank you for joining us on this edition of the Journal.
Darryl, thank you again for inviting me back to your show.
We are hearing that people are responding to this book intensely, perhaps would be the best word I could think of. The book is being bought by the dozens, literally, because people are starting to, I guess, identify with some of the concepts you're bringing up in the book. What we get in this book is a historic context for the situation African Americans or blacks, whichever term is politically correct this week, find themselves in this country, whether it be economic, political, whether it's the social pathology that we suffer from in this country, in our neighborhoods, or whatever it might be. Your book addresses it. It addresses it succinctly, and it addresses it with a scholarly and informational background. I commend you on the work in the book, and I'd like to ask you, what was the genesis for the book?
Darryl, there are probably a number of things. First of all, I could say there was a dissatisfaction with what was happening politically in this country as it was affecting black folk. I could say there was a response to the book The Bell Curve, which proclaimed that black folk were genetically inferior. Mm-hmm. And what I want to do is tell black Americans that you're not genetically inferior, that you've been socially engineered into your present predicament around this world. Mm-hmm. And I also could say that it was a response to the contract with white America. Mm-hmm. And to tell black folk that that contract is not new, that it was first issued in 1638 by the Maryland colony, mm-hmm. and nothing has changed, and that black folk are still fighting for self-sufficiency and competitiveness in this country, and that we must come together quickly or what risk being a permanent underclass in the society.
One of the alarming predictions you make in the book is along those lines. You mentioned that blacks will be pretty much a permanent underclass in America by the year 2015. Why the year 2015?
2015 because what I've concluded from analysis is that there's going to be a converging of social factors nationally and internationally that's going to place blacks in a permanent status of underclasship. And one, we anticipate by that point in time, based on all the research that's coming to us, that the next generation of whites is going to be more anti-black than they've been since the civil rights movement. Two, we anticipate by the same token about 86 million Hispanics coming into the United States and about 41 million Asians by that point in time, mm-hmm. which is going to kick black folk out of being the minority in the society, mm-hmm. Down to a minority. We've been number 2 in the society for 400 years as a group. We're going to become number 4. And if we have not gotten anything after being number 2 for 400 years, you guess what's going to happen when we become number 4. Because at that point in time, all the new groups coming into America, they're coming in higher than we are because this country operates off of a preferential acceptance program, mm-hmm. which means that groups are coming in based on skin color. They're going from the lightest down to the darkest. Light, yellow, brown, black. And that's what our immigration laws are based on. And black folk would not be able to penetrate through those groups to get to the white society when that happens, because those groups owe us nothing. They don't understand our problems, and they are competitive with us, and we don't begin to be a little more aggressive about being in a competitive posture. They're going to eat our lunches.
One of the things that I should mention right here is the fact that the book is filled with tables, graphs, charts, and historical accounts of how such discrimination, prejudice, and racism, economically, politically, and socially, were engineered into our system, literally codified mm-hmm. as a way blacks would be treated in this country. So that when we hear you talking about blacks becoming a permanent underclass, or we hear you talking about the inherent racism in the immigration system in the United States, you're not talking off the top of your head, are you?
No. See, the first immigration law was put in place immediately after the Revolutionary War in 1790, which declared this was to be a white country, and there was a zero quota placed on black folk. That zero quota stayed in place until about 1965. Based on the 1880 immigration laws, it moved up a slight bit, less than 1/2 of 1%, and to allow more blacks to come in. But in starting in 1965, it went up to 1/2 of 1%. That's why blacks are in a minority class in this country. That's why you cannot get Haitians into the country, because the larger society is extremely fearful of blacks getting a numerical dominance. And they built a quota system into the country, even in our immigration process, and into our to make sure that black folk do not constitute a threat.
And so, of course, I should say, if we look at the historical record, it becomes clear that blacks certainly didn't work to engineer their own demise in America. It was pretty much a construct based on second-class, third-class status that we had in society as the labor class, the free labor class, basically. You address that quite extensively in this book.
Yeah, we were always, see, we've operated off the base of a three-tiered structure. We had the elite class, or the aristocratic class, then we had the management class, which was made up of poor whites, and we had the working class, which was black folks. See, black folk were the working class, contrary to the popular myth up until about the civil rights movement. Blacks were the working class. Now, after the civil rights movement and blacks became obsolete, now poor whites and some of the other whites are claiming that they are the working class in this country. But they were not. They were supposed to be the management class up until that point in time. Blacks were the labor class in the society.
It's interesting that you bring that up, but wouldn't it be fair to look through the tunnel of history and see that certainly poor whites have worked hard in this country and have had to come up through some of the same kinds of tyranny that blacks have experienced in America?
Oh, yes, they have. You will always have some poor whites because that's a class issue. That's not a race issue. See, if it had been a race issue instead of a class issue, then why didn't you have poor whites out there picking cotton along with blacks? Why weren't they enslaved? Why didn't you have poor Indians? Why didn't you have poor Asians? Why didn't you have poor Hispanics out there in the field with black folk? It was a racial issue, not a class issue.
When you take a look at what's wrong, and certainly the book does cover a lot of what's wrong with black America, is it fair to say that at this time in our history, economically speaking, that blacks can, as we have been told to, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps?
Yes, you can. With what you do have, you don't have very much of anything. The wealth and power, resources in this society have been frozen since 1790. It has not changed barely one iota. Okay, that's for instance, let's go back to 1860. On the eve of the Civil War, 5% of the American population, the white population, controlled 24.6% of the wealth in the country. Now, after a Civil War, World War I, World War II, a Depression, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement, it went up 1 point. Okay, so then it's 24 point something like 6. Okay, now at the same time, on the eve of the Civil War, black folk at that time had 1% of the wealth. Black folk now, after that same point in time, all those social turmoils and international upheavals, black folk now up to a little less than 1% still. That means we moved up less than 1/2 after all that turmoil in the world. So obviously the wealth is frozen in this society. Whites now control almost 100%, Darryl, of all the wealth, the income, the power, the resources, the privileges, the businesses, and all levels of government. Black folk do not have the sufficient wherewithal to be able to manage their lives and compete. Now, contrary to what anybody tells you, we cannot compete because we don't have it. It's not a question of that we are genetically inferior or inferior as human beings. It's that you do not have the appropriate tools and devices and controls and mechanisms to be able to compete with other groups.
But certainly we can look and see in this society where blacks are matriculated economically, educationally, politically, there's some advancement.
Oh yes, most definitely there's some, because there's always going to be an exception to the rule. I mean, I've heard people ask me on different shows, Dr. Anderson, if things are that bad for black folk, well, how do you explain Bill Cosby and Oprah and Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan? What does that mean? What it means is white racism is not perfect. That's what it means. You'll always have exceptional blacks for a number of reasons. First of all, you'll have some exceptional blacks simply because they defy and beat mathematical probabilities, point one. Point two, you will have some blacks who will survive and do extremely well simply because whites want to be able to demonstrate that the society is not totally shut out, against black folk, locked up against black folk. And thirdly, you will find there'll be some exceptional blacks who have been picked or chosen by some of the white power structures, say, this is my black, this is a special black. Now, in history, we had a special name for those individuals that I talked about in the book. Those what we call some ultra-conservative blacks who see things strictly through the eyes of white folk, and they've learned how to subordinate themselves and to try their best to protect and maintain the status quo, and for that they're rewarded by the white society.
Well, they've matriculated through the educational system, they've moved up through the political system, they've survived social penury, and they've gone on to achieve something. Isn't that worth something?
Oh, most definitely. But see, but unless it's tied back and networked back into the larger black body, it has very little impact on black folk.
Why do you think it is that blacks then do not tie their successes individualistically as they may be viewed back into the group?
Because black folk have bought into a lot of the basic premises in the Constitution, which says that to be successful, it must be based on what an individual can achieve in and of his own. That is not true. At the same time, black folk were being subjected as a group in this country when the Constitution was being drafted and implemented and approved. You had something like about 3 million black folk who were subjected to slavery. So then, see, whites have never as a group been enslaved in this nation. So they had a right to be able to go out and experiment and achieve, and as far as their God-given rights were given.
And
allow them to. But see, racism means race. It comes from the word group. And blacks are still perceived as a group in this country. We went into racism, we went into slavery as a group, we went into Jim Crowism as a group. We can only come out as a group. And individualism has no significance unless it's not tied back into trying to help that group come out of that deplorable condition.
Then, because we just don't have enough time to address everything that I would like you to address, if we take a look at a few points and just summarily talk about them. For instance, what's wrong with blacks politically in America, and why haven't we made more strides?
Because for a number of reasons. First of all, because we still tend to think that partisanship is important to black folk. But whites do not place as much importance on political partisanship, as we do. See, when black folk did not belong to any party, and they were independent, they were enslaved. From 1618 up until 1866, blacks were slaves. They didn't belong to any party, and they got slavery out of it. From 1866 to 1936, about 96% of all the blacks in the United States belonged to the Republican Party. What they got was Jim Crowism out of it. From 1936 up to 1996, almost 97% of all the blacks in the United States belonged to the Democratic Party. What they've gotten is benign neglect. So partisanship is not the issue. The issue is that black folk have never had an effective strategy for dealing with white racism in this country. That's the issue. And we have never sat down and say, how do we go about dealing with structural racism? If we are the only planned minority in the country, as I just indicated to you a few minutes ago that we were planned into it by a public policy which says that the quota on black folk is zero. You're not going to have anybody going abroad, bringing black folk through refugee programs into the United States from Somalia or Ethiopia or from Haiti. You're not going to do it because they're fearful of blacks. There's a quota on blacks in this country. So we have never sat down and said, how do we win as a minority? You can win as a minority population if you learn and find out how it's been done in the past. Jews are a minority religious group, but they do win. The National Rifle Association is a minority social civic group, but they do win. The wealthy elite in this country is a minority group, but they do win. When will we sit down and strategize, how do we win as a minority?
And I guess perhaps the more operative word in that sentence might be, how do we win as a group?
That's right, as a minority group.
Now, do blacks have to act in concert then? Is what you're saying, blacks have to act in concert if they are going to stave off becoming a permanent underclass?
That's right, because that's how you perceive. You must deal with the realities of life. You are perceived as a group. And you must act like a group. You must do everything in block. You must practice group economics. You must practice group politics. For instance, in politics, what I would tell blacks to do is just the opposite of what everyone else is telling them. Never divide yourself. Anything that divides you weakens you. You live in a society where the social premise is that the majority wins and the minority loses. Okay? Now, never divide yourself along political lines. Stay as a block. If necessary, go independent. Do not split yourself up among the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and Independent Party. You're weaker now than you ever were. Vote as a block. Go out right now and register any and every black that can vote. Then pull yourself out of every party and hold yourself above both of the national parties and say, I don't care who runs for an office. We will deliver our vote as a block to whoever makes the greatest promise to black folk and deliver for us. That's who we'll vote for. And we will not tell you who we're going to vote for until the day of the election.
So you actually exercise some leverage.
That's right, and you demand respect. And at that point in time, they'll watch you and they give some credence to the effects of your vote. And more importantly, you should also create an independent party in this country for black folk, so that whenever if
Ross Perot, if he runs to Ross Perot, he's trying to do that.
Well, if Ross Perot runs, you're going to find a greatest move in this country to the independent parties. If a person runs for the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and Ross Perot runs, you got a three-way split. Run a black candidate in an independent party, and that way try to take the election with 26% of the vote. Demand respect from people. Whether or not you win or lose is not the point. Get your issues out there, support your own issues, and support your people as a group.
Educationally, where are we missing it then? If part of the problem is blacks not being able to have political power and certainly not being able to have economic power, then a part of that equation has something to do with what's happening to us educationally in this country. Where are we missing it, And where do blacks have to go to get it?
We're missing it educationally because we've never sat down and discussed the historical relationship between us and the educational system in this country. Remember, the educational system was designed on a public policy that's gone in a complete circle, 360 degrees. First of all, we were denied education. Then we moved from a denied educational basis to desegregated education prior to the Civil War. Then we moved after the Civil War into segregated education. Then by the 1950s, we went back to desegregated education, and now we're back into a state of denial of education. Then I'm going to talk about dismantling the school system, going to voucher systems, or going to some kind of private school system. What that means, Darryl, is that black folk fail to understand that schools are not change agents. They're only doing what the environment wants it to do. Schools in this country, starting in the 1860s, were designed to create a manual labor force for whites society, period. Black folk became obsolete in the mid-1960s. They no longer need us as a labor class. So therefore, the schools are dysfunctional because they no longer need black folk. If we really want to make our schools functional, we have to come up with a national public policy about what we want our schools to do for black folk.
Isn't that a slap in the face to all the black educators and administrators in big cities across this country who are in charge of school systems?
No, it's not, because because nobody's ever sat down with them and say where it is that black folk want to go. Suppose right now we want to, let's say if we had a national public policy on black folk, just as whites have always had a national public policy on us. They've had a policy on us, but we never had one for ourselves about what it is that we want to do as black folk. Suppose right now we want to go to the moon. Then once we decide where we want to go in a public policy, then it becomes incumbent upon all those educators and all those school systems to say, now what must our school systems do in terms of instilling in our kids the attitudes, the skills, the competencies to be able to get us to the moon. See, right now, the schools are not delivering because they don't know what we want them to do. So the schools are dysfunctional. And that's why in Detroit, Michigan, for instance, the 57% of all the black kids that start the first grade in Detroit never graduate from high school. Where are the kids going to go? No one has ever told the schools what it is that you want them to do for black folk. The schools are still using the same books, the same curriculum that they've been using for 100 years in the system. And now that you got an 80% black population in the city where it used to be about a 4 or 5% black population. Now, you got to go back and say, hold it a minute, stop. What is it that you want the schools to do? And for black folk, now you have a predominantly black community, and we don't have that. And then you got to interlink that school system to the churches and to the business communities and to the civic organizations to help fulfill the demands of that community.
So you're talking about linking all these institutions that exist in the black community, but what are they, being undervalued or underutilized or ignored?
They must be interlinked. They must be interlinked with all of them trying to achieve the same common objective. We don't have that now.
And this is where this national public policy that you talk about in the book comes in.
That's right. We must have a national public policy that says to black folk, we can be successful, we can be self-sufficient, we can be independent, and we can be competitive if we have a national public policy so that every black knows what he has to do as an organization, individual, or corporation to get us there.
That's a radical notion, and certainly you have met with some kind of opposition, not only without the white community, outside the black community, that is from whites, but certainly inside the black community, there have got to be people who disagree with your assertions.
You know, the funniest thing about that, I would have anticipated that initially, but at this point in time, after 1 year of running around all over the country and out of the country, and the book right now is #1 and #2 in Black America. It is also #1 in Barbados, Bermuda, and Brazil. And I've just gotten back from Brazil with the Prime Minister, and the Speaker of the Parliament sent me a letter. And I just got a letter now from the governor in Brazil. Let me tell you one thing. I have not had one single black publicly to disagree with anything in the book or disagree with the point of the Institute that's going to try to move blacks across this country in a totally different direction. We're going to move collectively, and I've got millions of blacks now around this country who I've made contact with through various forms of media, public appearances, who said, we are with you 100%. We're going to turn it around. We can do it. We're going to be a competitive group. We're going to rebuild our own communities. We're going to rebuild our schools and our communities and our businesses and interlink them, and we're going to come out with pride, self-sufficiency, and competitiveness.
What about the millions more who say we can't do it? There have got to be multiplied millions of people who say, blacks in America are just too divided to buy into this. This sounds oversimplistic. It sounds like pie in the sky.
You're going to have a lot of people say that, and they would probably fall into 2 or 3 categories. First of all, you can have people who've given up to the realities of our conditions, who said simply, things are that bad for us. It's best for me to go side in with the other conservatives in the country and just live with that reality. You're going to have that. You're going to have others who are vested, they're in that small quota. As I said, in the integration process, whites prefer 0 blacks, but they would tolerate somewhere between 5 to 8%. Now, blacks who've integrated into the system and now vested because they are rather comfortable in their material accumulations, they're going to be resistant, okay? But unfortunately, I have not run into any of those yet. Then thirdly, you're going to find black folk who are going to simply say that I'm just either too tired or too indifferent to do anything. And what I would say to all three of those groups, stay where you are. There's an old rule in social dynamics that says if you want the same results, keep doing the same thing. And right now, black folk are not progress in this country, contrary to myth. We're in terms of quality of life and the social discomfort index, we are where we were in about 1840s. So keep standing and waiting, because the wagon is coming. I can guarantee you that the Jesse Helms and Newt Gingrich and some of the far right-wing groups in this country are making preparation for black folk. So you tell those who don't want to join the movement and try to change our conditions in this country, make black folk self-sufficient and competitive, you sit there and wait for them to come get you, because they're going to come.
Dr. Anderson, it's been enlightening, and it's been controversial. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me again.
And of course, you are watching Detroit Black Journal.